Do you want to talk about Jay Briscoe a little bit?
Oh yeah, it feels like it's been so long because we haven't done a show in the time period since then. I don't know about you, but I've been watching so much Jay Briscoe. It's been insane. I've been diving around all different eras and times. It's just the sad. I hate to do the sad Olympics of wrestler deaths or anything, but I don't know. But this one just hit me so fucking hard. I was like, I couldn't escape like that black cloud hovering over me for days.
I was gonna say funny is the wrongest word, but we had Dawn at the end of December, which I think is a very similar, like, one that hits me really hard emotionally. And then for 2 weeks later, not that I'm a horrible, uncaring person who doesn't care about Jay Briscoe's death, but he obviously means a great deal more to you as a deep in the weeds Ring of Honor fan than he does to me, a casual Ring of Honor fan who's seen plenty of Briscoe's matches in my day. But to have those back to back, like those real personal ones to us individually, it sucks.
I think the thing with Jay too was it got sent to me. I had just woken up. And I read it, and like my first instinct was, why did someone send me this fake Tony Khan tweet, like just to fuck with me? Like I didn't even comprehend that it could be a real thing, and yeah, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I just went out for a drive and like parked out in like a nice park area and just listened to "Give Me Back My Bullets" on repeat for like an hour. Because it was like that, like sort of internalizing it. I can only really speak from my own sort of takes about it, but because, you know, if you want like a full retrospective and thing, go listen to the Flagship at the time. They had a wonderful segment and a wonderful opening to their show with just the myriad of great Briscoe's promos.
Oh, seeing that the day passed where it's just like Twitter was just every second post was a great Jay Briscoe promo. And when you look at that man and look in his eyes as he cuts a promo, he believes every single word out of his mouth. And it kind of ruins other promos for you where you look at other people and it's like, you don't believe it. You don't even begin to believe it. And then you look at Jay Briscoe and like, that's a real character. That's not even a character. That's a real person. He's not doing an act. He's not playing a role.
And the craziest thing is, by all accounts, he was doing an act.
Yeah.
Like it was a gimmick. It was a gimmick that he transcended that line and it became real. Like that's the insane thing about Jay Briscoe, is he had an authenticity that you just do not see now. I saw someone like make a poster at the time where they were talking about how he has like the same eyes as Macho Man. Like when you're watching them like go through that promo, and like, I was watching a promo when they're talking about it, and I was like, he does. He has that same like intense, real eyes that you see from Macho Man.
And there's very like another Samoa Joe, I think, is a very good example of someone who you see even doing silly WWE bullshit. He's one of the very, very few people who can make even that feel legitimate, like watching Joe during that run. And that there's not many people that can do those promos and feel real. Like even MJF, who can do some fantastic promos, every time you're like, that man's doing a professional wrestling promo. Every time.
Yeah, you believe him to be a character.
Whereas you look at Jay Briscoe and that man is just speaking.
Yeah, there's not many people where you look at them and you're like, as they do their pro wrestling stick, that you're like, oh, this feels like an actual person.
You legitimately get lost in it. Like you really can get lost in the character. You believe it. It's still real to me. Damn it.
Like, you know, we've talked about it probably on those earlier shows when he showed up in TNA, where I was like, I consider Jay Briscoe to be one of the best wrestlers of all time, and just reliving a lot of his big top tier matches has kind of reaffirmed that for me, because even I'm just talking about the single stuff, and despite like just talking about the single stuff, he's also maybe in the best tag team of all time. So
yeah, when you think about all the teams from the eras, they like just Ring of Honor teams. You can think of the American Wolves, you can think of the Kings of Wrestling, you can think of Austin Aries and Roderick Strong, you can think of the Young Bucks, you can think of SCU, you can think of
Generico and Steen,
just their contemporaries in the company they worked in. Never mind like Motor City Machine Guns, LAX, AMW, the Usos, all those other teams, and they're still probably the best team of the last 20 years, maybe ever.
Yeah, like it's always been like an internal like 1 and 2 of the Bucks and the Briscoes, and depending on the last match I saw, like it's one or the other. You know what I mean? Like that's how good like they were. I mean, also like maybe one of the most influential teams of all time, one of the best in-ring teams of all time. Like the only thing they don't have is like a worldwide television run, which was like, as like shitty as it feels, that was one of the first things that I thought of was like, you know, fuck Turner, because they could have had the last 2 years on AEW television. I'm glad that there's so many people who didn't know about the Briscoes that now do know about the Briscoes, but they could have had that same thing happen in the last 2 years, you know? They could have had all of these crazy matches in that tag division on worldwide television, and they could have been this known quantity to the wider context of the pro wrestling fan. And that's like one of the most upsetting things out of it from a career perspective over these last few years. And, you know, and maybe there's a chance that they were even the reason that fucking Ring of Honor didn't get television, which is insane as well. It's just a horrid mix of these last couple of years. And at the same time, like from a business perspective in that way, it's also probably like they had one of their strongest years.
Yeah, because a few years ago, everyone was like, Briscoe's best team of all time, slowing down a little bit. And then last year, they had 3 of the best matches of the year.
And you could see from their perspective too, is like they were kind of they were doing the Ring of Honor thing, but that's all they were doing, and they were kind of like running around in circles. And it wasn't really a matter of them not delivering. I think it was more of a matter of it must have been kind of hard to get excited about things when you've been doing the same thing for the last decade on a company that hasn't really shown a lot of upward trajectory. And then as soon as, like, you know, the Ring of Honor stuff shut down and they didn't know if they were going to be getting contracts or whatever, you felt that fire reignite in them.
Yeah, even like if you go back to Final Battle last year where they had that match against the Kingdom, which I think was like the kind of the start of their killer year, as opposed to the start of like the FTR match in April, which I think obviously more people probably watched.
For me, it was as soon as they started doing NWA.
That was changed everything for you?
No, that's when like I felt that fire in them come back, because they were doing the heel shtick then. They were like, again, cutting these great promos, because they had also just been like stalwart baby faces of Ring of Honor for such a long time. And to like, they turned heel and they were doing the NWA stuff, and they were like going in there with, it was Brody King and it was probably PCO, right? And they were doing that, like, because that was when ROH and the NWA had started collaborating, and like that sort of like heel run. That's when I was like, oh, the Briscoes they're getting it back. You know, I can feel the fire in them. Then, you know, Ring of Honor was shutting down. They had the Great Kingdom match, and they were talking about how, you know, Ring of Honor's done, but it's not the end of the Briscoes. And that was true. They went out there on the indies. They started killing it. They had the Great Impact run, which is like such a cool full circle moment too, because like, as we talked about when they did those NWA-TNA shows at the start, it was a kind of a crazy idea that the Briscoes never were a staple of TNA.
Yeah, and even just one of those things that, like, they never shared a ring with AMW.
Which is, that's one of the things I was thinking about. It's like, they've wrestled everyone. And somehow the AMW, which on paper feels like such a slam dunk match and feud, to have the Briscoes and AMW colliding. And it's kind of a mind-blowing, because they even did the LAX one in ROH. Yeah,
and it's just one of those things. You would have looked at like 04, 05, 06. The 2 best teams in the world are probably the Briscoes and America's Most Wanted. And somehow they just never wrestled. And it was a nice moment, I thought, both for like a celebrating TNA 20-year history thing and a celebrating Ring of Honor 20-year history thing, where the first time they did share a wrestling ring was Slammiversary last year. Fair enough, not in a wrestling capacity. But it's like AMW and the Briscoes sharing a ring, celebrating both companies' respective 20-year histories. It was a lovely little moment that kind of flew under the radar. And there was even a TV 6-man tag where Storm teamed with the Briscoes, which I thought was a nice little thing too.
And one thing I came out of it too, like, just, you know, the work is one thing. I always thought, and I think you saw it in Impact specifically, just from some of the segments they did, this was such a TV ready act. Like, you saw them doing the Good Brothers segment on the farm, That honestly, watching that is something that hit me pretty hard. I was like, there's a good chance we never get another Briscoe's Farm segment, which has become such a staple of my pro wrestling media absorption. Like, those segments, whenever you see one, you're like, yes, Briscoe's on the Briscoe Farm, and like that might be a thing that we don't get anymore, and that's another like real sad aspect of it. It's just, I whenever I see them, I'm like, these two were like made for American television wrestling as well. They had it all. They had everything, and it's a real shame that we never quite got it on that level. Like, they were on TV forever, Ring of Honor, but it just think of how they obviously have a legacy, and a legacy that's going to stay firm with the pro wrestling fan, but their legacy could have been so much bigger if they were presented on this worldwide scale.
Yeah, and it's hopefully a legacy that Mark can at least fulfill some of going forward.
Yeah. The Mark Briscoe Jay Lethal match too. What a remarkable piece of pro wrestling that was.
Mark Briscoe's a very good pro wrestler.
Yeah, and I mean, like, wrestling doesn't really matter in this kind of circumstances, but it's a wrestling show, so let's talk about wrestling. The idea of like doing Mark versus Claudio at Supercard of Honor, that, and like, Mark winning the title, that just seems like the thing,
Yeah.
And also, full credit to Mark as well, like, dealing with all this. Like, just a beacon of fucking sunrise, like, during this, like, sad, tumultuous time.
Yeah, I was saying to you, like, obviously, I haven't lost one of my brothers, thankfully. So I don't know how I would be if I did, but I do not think I would have near the amount of poise and grace, and almost like he's almost still uplifting, which is like just utterly remarkable.
An immensely strong person. What a remarkable run to have from an in-ring perspective, in the fact that they hit like two completely different types of pro wrestling and they excelled to the top level in both. The first half of their career being like these high-spotty, innovative tag team matches that are going 100 miles an hour, and like, being up there with guys like Marufuji and Kenta as influencing the whole style. And then the back half of this amazing run being like, all right, now let's slow it down and do these methodical brawls and these old school wars that were equally like, they excelled in that style as well. They completely switched, and they still kept it to that level. It's insane.
Yeah, and like just the longevity as a team is just, well, when you think about how just insanely young they were when they did all of their best stuff. They were in their early 20s, sometimes teens, which is insane to even think about. And like, it's unheard of for a tag team to have a 20-year run. Like, the Young Bucks are currently only on 15-ish. They'll get there, but like, for a 20+ year run for a tag team is completely and utterly unheard of in pro wrestling. It just does not happen for various reasons. And not only a 20-year run on the level of the Briscoes. It's not just they were around. Like, the Rock and Roll Express still had matches later in their career, but they basically didn't have any memorable ones after the 90s until their bizarre resurgence.
20 years on top.
Yeah, they were a top best team in the world caliber team for 20 years.
Like, the Bucks, they're at like 18 or 19 years. But you got to remember, they didn't start breaking out until like 2007, 2008. So, like, as a top team, it's only been like 15. But the Briscoes, they broke out almost immediately.
In a very competitive scene as well.
And they stood out too. And just aura. Like, that is a team that just has aura as heels, as baby faces. Like, bottled chaos is what they felt like. And you were just waiting for it to fucking, the cork to pop, and then the Briscoes were going to go off.
As you mentioned, we've talked a little Briscoes on this show before, because they popped up for a couple matches in 2002. And as you mentioned, we'll talk a little Briscoes on the show again, very far down the line, for their tag title win all the way in 2022.
Which is, what a cool full circle moment that was too.
Yeah, 20 years later. But what a loss to wrestling. As I said, hopefully Mark can carry it forward.
And hopefully it gives, like, as a community, like, it gives us the reflection necessary to be like, maybe if people actually do show meaningful change, we should give them the opportunity. It's very easy to write people off. And a lot of the times I can understand how it is. Because, like, how can you trust anyone to actually change and evolve, but like there is something to be said about the practice of what's the point of wanting people to change if when they do you still punish them, you know?
Yeah, it's where all the like dumb cancel culture stuff comes from, the people who complain about it. Because like it is a tricky question to answer of like what is the punishment for these kind of indiscretions? And the answer is it's always different. It always depends on the circumstances and the person, and it always depends on the amount of contrition and growth they show. And it depends again on like how severe the thing they did was, and whether or not they're a person with a public platform, and how you should treat that differently. And like there is no answer to that question. There's none, and it's different for every person because everybody has a right not to accept an apology. Everybody has a right to like not accept forgiveness. That's their personal right to do so. So it's one of those things where like that's where you just cancel people. It's like. It's a really complicated question to answer, and one, as I said, that just doesn't have one. It'll be different in every single scenario. And in this case, as we talked a little about, like Warner Bros. Discovery, a company that has showed their ass in a lot of ways in the last 6 months, but particularly in this situation, where it was very, very clear that Jay Briscoe was a person who did that work, and people who I would trust vouched that he did that work, and they still held that against him.
It's a tough thing. And maybe it's because it's a thing that's really only popped up in the last decade or so, but we don't really have like an answer for how to do it yet, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like how to allow reintegration from people who have seemingly made real life positive change. And that's like a thing that now we are on the other side of, where it's like, how many people is that going to be a situation like that? You know, it's like, it's a very interesting sidebar from a very necessary societal step.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like when you think about what's the way you should probably respond to this to have the least damage done to yourself. It's ignore, deny, keep going as is. And for the most part, you won't be punished. That's the thing about the people keep on going on about cancel culture, but for the most part, people that have been quote unquote cancelled can just keep their head down, push on, and Dana White still gets his television show. Like that's ultimately what happens in the end. Like bad people are not punished. So that's also like the other side of it. Like there is no real punishment. It's really like whether or not you're willing to do that work and take yourself out of situations yourself. Unless you commit like real horrible indiscretions, in which case you are largely forced out of public spaces. But yeah, it's one of those where, as I said, there's no correct answer there. There will never be a correct answer. So that's the reason you get the worst people shouting about it in the worst way, and everyone else trying to like fumble their way through it.
Yeah.